You know how I talk about that black triumvirate of the church plant pastors, the black Greek letter organizations, the black civic organizations, the Prince Hall Freemasons, the academics, the politicians, the media, the athletes and entertainers and directors and those folks, how they conspire to keep black people in a permanent state of victimhood. They do that in order to continue to leech off of the black community at large, leech off of the people that live in lower class status, continue to pump this hyper materialism, continue to pump this hyper consumerism into the community in order to continue to leech of the community. That keeps them in a permanent state of victimhood. They don't advocate for biblical truth. They don't advocate for biblical values. They don't advocate for social norms. They don't advocate for things that lead to prosperity, that lead to true economic opportunity, true educational opportunity, true liberation in the black community. All these people running around talking about liberation, they don't want to liberate anything. They want to liberate the money from your pocketbook. That's what they want to liberate. So what happened as a part of the Great Migration is that the culture that was present in the North and the culture that was present by the mulattoes and the folks that were part of the upper crust in the black community was overrun by folks that had this slave mentality, folks that didn't have morals, folks that had a form of religion, but it really wasn't true relationship with Christ, folks that did not believe in adhering to traditional values. That culture immigrated from the South into the ghettos in the North, and through the assistance of those in the white community with money that wanted to continue to elevate degeneracy, it began to rise to the point to where now the black American redneck culture is what a lot of people consider black culture. And another thing that has happened as a result of the dumb down of knowledge in the black community in terms of economics is that a lot of people are not aware of their opportunities when it comes to investing in gold and silver and other precious metals as a part of their retirement portfolio. To download a free resource that talks about how to incorporate gold and silver and other precious metals into your retirement portfolio, please go to thebiblicalconservative.com/gold or click on the link in the description.
Such concentrations of black pioneers and leaders in a few highly atypical cultural enclaves suggests that their achievements were not solely a matter of individual ability, cream rising to the top, but were also a result of a culture very unlike that in which most blacks were raised and educated. However much the achievements of these individuals have been celebrated, the culture behind those achievements has not been. Today, the culture that is celebrated in much of the media and in the schools is not the culture that succeeded, but the culture that has failed, the black redneck culture. When white couples who adopt black children are warned to be sure to put those children in touch with their cultural heritage, all too often that means the black redneck culture. Internal cultural differences among blacks have long been extreme, ranging from such things as urbanization, education, and regional distribution, to rates of crime, economic achievement, and general acculturation to the norms of the surrounding society. Historically, the most fundamental difference for many generations was between those blacks who were slaves and those who were free. They differed not only in their legal status, but also in their regional distribution, their degree of urbanization, and even biologically. There were free blacks as far back as the 17th century. In fact, there were free blacks before there were slaves in America. The first Africans brought in captivity to colonial Virginia in 1619 became indentured servants, like the white indentured servants who were common in colonial America. Only later, with the mass importation of Africans, did this change. The first law in America recognizing perpetual slavery appeared in 1661 in Virginia. The small class of free blacks in colonial America had fewer restrictions than other free blacks would have in the 19th century, and many of them and their descendants made use of their opportunities. There was a black writer named Gustavus Vasa, whose book was popular enough to go through 8 editions at a time when the vast majority of blacks were still illiterate slaves in the South. Benjamin Banneker was a publisher of almanacs and was also one of those who designed the layout of the city of Washington. Again, long before most blacks were either free or able to read and write. There were not just isolated individual blacks who were culturally more advanced than other blacks, but whole classes of blacks who had achieved cultural levels that most blacks would not achieve until many generations later. The size of the free black population increased after the United States came into existence as an independent nation, as the ideology of freedom associated with the American Revolution led most northern states to abolish slavery, and even in the South, enough white slave owners freed their slaves to cause the free black population there to nearly double and then redouble between 1790 and 1810. Both the regional distribution and the degree of urbanization of free and enslaved blacks differed greatly. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the cotton plantations of the Deep South began to draw slaves away from upper South states like Virginia and North Carolina toward more southerly states like Mississippi and Alabama, sometimes as individuals sold down the river and often as part of whole plantations that relocated. Thus, the geographic center of the black population moved steadily southwestward at an average of about 50 miles per decade. Meanwhile, the free persons of color were moving in the directly opposite direction. While more than 90% of the antebellum black population lived in the South, the free persons of color were evenly divided between the states of the North and South, and within the South, they tended to leave the Deep South and gravitate toward that region's less oppressive places farther north. The difference in geographic distribution was so extreme that in 1860 there were more free blacks living in the city of Washington alone than in the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia combined, these states having huge concentrations of slaves. The slave and the free also differed greatly in urbanization. While most black slaves worked in rural settings, by 1860 the free persons of color were more urbanized than even the white population. There were cultural consequences to these historic and geographic differences. While the vast majority of slaves could neither read nor write, the census of 1850 showed that most free persons of color were literate. But it would be half a century later, 2 generations after emancipation, before the same would be true of the black population as a whole. It would be 1940 before the black population as a whole became as urbanized as the free persons of color were in 1850. The cultural head starts of this segment of the black population had enduring consequences. The descendants of the antebellum free persons of color remained predominant among black leaders in many fields well into the 20th century, and they included W.E.B. Du Bois, Thomas Fortune, Charles Waddell Chestnut, Thurgood Marshall, John Hope Franklin, and many others. Most black holders of doctoral degrees in the middle of the 20th century, as well as most Negroes working in the professions in the nation's capital at that time, were by all indications descendants of the antebellum free persons of color, a group that was never more than 14% of the black population.
And so you see that during the 1800s and as we approach the Civil War and after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction period and before the turn of the century to 1900, there was a small crust of black people. Most of them were mulattoes. So those were the ones that had the sensibilities of the white elite, the white aristocracy, essentially. People like to refer to them as the black aristocracy or the black Afrostocracy. Those were the ones that had that mentality, W.E.B. Du Bois and those folks that came from the upper crust within the black community, the talented 10th and those kind of folks. And so you had this division in the black community between those of the upper crust, the black bougie elite, and the masses, the ones that came from slavery and had that slave mentality. But the problem is that as the generations started to move forward, the ones that had the slave mentality became the dominant feature within the black community. And the ones that came from the black bougie elite, the old black bougie elite, because there's a new black bougie elite, but the old black bougie elite became less and less and less. Now you have the dominant group in the black community came from the black masses that had this black redneck mentality, this slave master mentality, this slave mentality. And they became the dominant culture in the black community.
As a group, the free persons of color also differed from the slaves in racial mixture. As in most of the Western Hemisphere, freed slaves were often the offspring of those who freed them, and the adults freed were more often female than male. While only 8% of slaves met the stringent U.S. Census requirement of half or more white ancestry to be classified as mulatto, 37% of the free persons of color did. This is not to say that all the others in either category were of pure African ancestry, but there were very noticeable skin color differences between the more acculturated descendants of those freed before the Civil War and those freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. The noticeably greater success of the former was often attributed to their white ancestry, both by whites and by some of the Negro elite themselves. But the historical and cultural antecedents of that success are undeniable. Moreover, the later rise of other blacks to similar levels of achievement undermines the biological explanation of these internal differences among blacks. The point here is that cultural differences led to striking socioeconomic differences among blacks, as they did among whites. In both races, those who lived within the redneck culture lagged far behind those who did not. That these cultural differences among blacks also coincided with biological differences did not mean that biology explained the differences in performance. The offspring of white slave owners not only had a better chance of being freed, they also tended to have better opportunities while still enslaved, being more likely to be house servants rather than field hands, and, in some cases, living the lives of de facto free persons while still legally in bondage. Reconstruction-era black Senator Blanche K. Bruce, for example, was during the era of slavery tutored alongside his owner's son, or other son, as many believed. During the antebellum era, there were other mulatto offspring of white slave owners who were given special consideration and aid. Some were sent to Oberlin College, sometimes with an intermediary handling financial arrangements, apparently to conceal the identity of the white father. This is not to say that most slave owners freed their mulatto offspring, but that, of those blacks freed voluntarily, mulattoes were far more common than among the slave population in general, and that women were freed more often than men. Moreover, this pattern prevailed throughout the Western Hemisphere. The point here is that the descendants of free persons of color had a cultural history that served them better than the cultural history of the descendants of slaves, even after the abolition of slavery ended differences in their legal status. Whether by individual escapes from slavery, by voluntary manumissions in the antebellum South, or by general emancipation by law in the northern states, a black class of free persons of color emerged long before the Emancipation Proclamation. The more prosperous of these families were able to educate their own children, sometimes through college, and these were typically lighter-skinned people, as well as people with generations of a head start in freedom and acculturation, as compared to the mass of enslaved blacks. The net result was that the elite among American Negroes tended to be, and to remain for generations after emancipation, a racially mixed group that married among themselves and formed a socially exclusive class. Among 19th century Negroes in Philadelphia, for example, 85% of mulatto men married mulatto women, and 93% of black men married black women. This was not solely a matter of color prejudice, for there were major behavioral differences between the two groups. The mulatto neighborhoods had lower crime rates and a higher percentage of their children attending school, as compared to the black neighborhoods, even though it can hardly be claimed that school attendance or crime rates are genetically predetermined. In short, there were major cultural differences, and these differences in turn produced other differences, such as a higher occupational status, better housing, and more wealth among the mulattoes. Nor was this pattern confined to Philadelphia. All across the country, North and South, the elite of the Negro community were lighter in complexion than the masses, and very self-conscious and sometimes snobbish about that fact. This remained so through at least the first half of the 20th century. Among the consequences of the extreme range of education and acculturation within the Negro community has been the larger society's erection of racial barriers provoked by black rednecks, which barriers then deeply offended those individuals at the other end of the cultural spectrum. These barriers, based on race, prevented cultural elites from separating themselves as much as they would like from lower-class blacks, with whom they were forced to live in proximity and to share institutions. Yet, protests against racial barriers had to be made in the name of all, light or dark, leading to charges of hypocrisy against the elites who spearheaded protests against white social and economic barriers, while maintaining their own social and economic barriers against the black lower class. That internal social barriers within the black community became more pronounced at the same time as white barriers against blacks in general suggests that more than coincidence was involved, since both occurred in the wake of the mass arrival of black rednecks from the South. Among the behavioral differences between the black elites and the black masses was that the elites had more stable families, with separation or divorce being rare among them. It took more than money or a light complexion to enter the social circles of the black elite. Behavioral standards were also essential, and individuals who met these standards could be admitted with little money and regardless of complexion, though the history of black rednecks meant that few would rise to elite levels. In the San Francisco Bay Area, as in the northern cities half a century earlier, there was a long-settled black population which lived free of the Jim Crow laws and practices of the South, and which had been able to get civil service jobs as far back as the 1920s. But although the newcomers were skilled workers more often than the local black residents, culturally, the newcomers lagged far behind. Native-born blacks in the Bay Area described the newcomers as foreign in the way they talked and in their behavior. For example, eating hamburgers openly on the bus, and bologna, and loud talking and fighting on the buses. That never happened in the old days. Some of the new blacks from the South were described as having a little more of a chip on their shoulder than the people out here did. Many local blacks thought that white racism increased after World War II, when both Southern blacks and Southern whites began arriving in large numbers.
And so that's what we have to keep in mind. We have to understand that the reason why the black triumvirate that I talk about, the ones that want to keep black people in a permanent state of victimhood, the reason why they don't want this information to be widespread is because it wasn't because of racism that we have what we have in certain parts of America. It wasn't because of the fact that white supremacy and the white man is keeping black people down. No, it's because of this black redneck culture, this slave mentality that a lot of people had coming up from the South, and they took that and ported that to the rest of America. And so it led to this whole black redneck lower class culture becoming the dominant culture, to where we have people fighting out in public. I just saw a video of people fighting off of a cruise ship that had just docked in Galveston Bay, and they were fighting, acting a fool. That's why you have this celebration of this quote unquote black culture, which originates from this lower class black redneck culture. That's not how black people used to behave. It's not. And that's why I say it is not black culture. It is this black culture that's been foisted upon black people because the people that fund this culture want black people portrayed like this. And you have the black triumvirate that go along with it because they're paid to elevate it and celebrate it. That's why we as Christians, especially biblical Christians who happen to be black, must reject it and must inject biblical truth and biblical values back into the culture, because that's the only way the culture will elevate and find its equilibrium and reset itself. Because we're not victims. We are empowered for greatness.